I signed the prenuptial agreement with trembling hands and tearful eyes, not because I was forced to, but because I believed I was protecting the man I loved from a past he could never understand. My family had nothing to boast about materially, and when his mother, a former judge with a scrutinizing gaze and a satisfied smile, watched me place my pen on the paper, she looked as if she had just won a silent battle I never even knew I was in. But 3 months later, a call from my father's private attorney wiped that smile off her face faster than any blessing she'd ever offered me. Before I take you deeper into the story that changed my entire life and the way I see love, value, and dignity, I want to ask you for something small but meaningful. Hit that follow button and turn on notifications, because if you've ever been judged by how you look where you're from or the color of your skin, this is the story for you. They say love is blind, but I've realized it's not love that's blind. It's us. We choose not to see something until the truth forces our eyes open. My name is Tiana, and this is the story of a piece of paper that seemed meaningless, but changed everything. This story began 2 years ago when I was still a third-grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary. The salary was barely enough to get by, but every day in the classroom with those kids was a nameless joy. That moment when they finally grasp a math problem or read a full story aloud. To me, that was a kind of wealth no money could measure. That Tuesday afternoon, like always, I was sitting at a small cafe on 5th Street grading papers with my usual red pen. And then a burst of laughter rang out from the next table. Not the polite, restrained kind, but a genuine warm laugh that made me look up. "Sorry," he said, catching my gaze, still chuckling. "My buddy just sent me the worst joke in the world." He had gentle brown eyes, neatly combed hair, and a perfectly tailored suit, the kind of man I only ever saw in financial dramas. But unlike the men in those shows, he wasn't arrogant. He held out his hand. "James," I replied, Tiana. And just like that, we talked for 2 hours straight. James worked at a big investment firm downtown, but he never once made me feel small. He listened as I told stories about my students, laughed at the chaos of classroom life, and asked thoughtful questions with genuine interest. The next 6 months, we were practically inseparable. He drove me to work, brought coffee during breaks, and spent weekends helping me hang up student artwork in my tiny classroom. I thought I had found a kind man, and in those days, I loved him with an open, unguarded heart. Our love grew through simple things, the surprise coffees, the quiet afternoons as James hung up children's drawings like they belonged in a gallery. I believed this love was strong enough to overcome any barrier. Until I met his family. That first dinner at James's home felt like stepping into a movie set. A colonial-style house in an upscale suburb, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, every detail oozed old money elegance. But it wasn't the decor that made me feel out of place. It was the atmosphere. Patricia James's mother was a former judge, and she still moved and spoke as if presiding over a courtroom. From the first moment, she gave me a paper-thin smile, the kind that never reaches the eyes. "Oh, so you're the teacher James mentioned," she said with a tone that mixed surprise and subtle judgment. The way she emphasized teacher made it sound more like a warning than a respected profession. Throughout the meal, Patricia said nothing outright offensive, but every word was carefully chosen to remind me I didn't belong. Teaching must be spiritually rewarding. She smiled. "I suppose the schedule's flexible, even if the pay isn't much." William James's father was gentler, asking a few questions about my students, but his eyes kept drifting toward his wife as if seeking silent permission before he spoke. James tried to smooth things over when it became obvious, but I could see he didn't really grasp the invisible cuts in his mother's words. He had grown up in a world where prejudice was wrapped in silk, where racial bias was called reasonable concern, and classism was labeled real-world pragmatism. But I loved him, and I chose to believe that if I was patient enough, gentle enough, they would see who I truly was, because I still naively believed that love was enough. That Saturday morning, the sun was gentle. James took me to the park where we'd had our first date. He held my hand. Said a few things that made me laugh. Then suddenly he was down on one knee. The ring was beautiful, sparkling like every girl's dream. I cried not from surprise, but from pure joy. In that moment, I believed everything I had done to fit in. The silences I'd swallowed the baked goods I brought to his family had finally been seen and appreciated. That feeling lasted about 30 seconds. Because that evening when we went to tell his family, the first thing his mother said wasn't congratulations. It was, I think we should discuss the prenuptial agreement. She said it in the same tone you'd use to choose wedding desserts. James looked briefly uncomfortable and turned to her. Mom, can't we at least celebrate first? But I saw it clearly. He wasn't going to stand up to her for me. Not really. That night, Patricia called me aside. Tiana, you understand this isn't personal. James has worked very hard to build his career, and your background. She paused as if letting me fill in the blanks. We just want to protect what belongs to James. My background, meaning black working class, not part of their world. The contract arrived the next morning. Its terms were cold and clinical. I would have no claim to James's assets no matter how long we were together. If we divorced, I'd receive financial support for exactly 2 years. If he died, I'd get a small life insurance payout, nothing from his estate. And worst of all, if I ever damaged the family's reputation, I'd lose everything. James sat beside me as his mother's lawyer read it all aloud. He grimaced and squeezed my hand, but never objected. It's just a formality, sweetheart, he whispered. Formality. To me, it was everything. It showed me exactly how they saw me. A threat. A gold digger. A poor girl clinging to their son to escape her life. And the worst part was, some part of me believed they had a reason to think so. So I signed. Tears streamed down my face, and when I looked up, Patricia was smiling. That victorious smile like she had just secured her power over a worthless pawn. I had no idea that just 3 months later, their perfect world would be turned upside down by the very girl they tried to diminish. 3 months after the engagement, while I was still trying to live with the shadow of that frozen contract, my father collapsed. He had raised me alone since I was small after my mother died in a car accident. A simple man driving his old Honda for years, working some dull office job I never paid much attention to, but no matter how busy work got, he never missed a parent-teacher meeting, never missed a school play. He didn't have much money, but he gave me a world full of dignity. He taught me to be strong, to never let anyone look down on me because of where I came from. To me, he was a hero, my whole world. When he was rushed to the hospital after a severe heart attack, I never left his side. 3 days and nights I prayed endlessly. James was there too, bringing coffee, rubbing my back, saying the soft words that reminded me why I once loved him. On the 3rd morning, my father held my hand. His lips dry, he whispered, "Sweetheart, when this is over, go to the bank. Safe deposit box. Everything you need to know is there." 2 hours later, he passed. The funeral was simple, just as he had wanted. A few co-workers, some neighbors, a few teachers from my school. I still remember the scent of chrysanthemums, the autumn breeze, and a hollow ache I didn't know how to name. I thought losing my father was the greatest pain I would ever feel. But it turned out it was only the beginning of a much bigger truth, a truth I was never prepared to face. A week after the funeral, I received a call from a man named Mr. Thompson. He introduced himself as my father's personal lawyer, someone who had worked with him for over 20 years. I was stunned. My father had a personal lawyer. He left very specific instructions for you, he said. You need to go to the central bank and open a safe deposit box. Alone. I arrived at the bank both curious and bewildered. The building was grand and old with towering stone columns like a temple, a high ceiling, and glittering chandeliers. A staff member led me down to the basement and handed me the key. When the door of the safe opened, I nearly froze. Inside were dozens of envelopes filled with documents, photos, handwritten letters. And right on top was a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1995, Black Tech Entrepreneur Sells Startup for $2.8 billion. I looked closer at the photo. The man in it was my father. Younger, but unmistakably him shaking hands with suited executives at a press conference. I kept flipping through the contents. There were stock certificates, bank statements, investment portfolios, pictures of my father at tech conferences, charity galas, even standing beside public figures I'd seen on the cover of Forbes. Hands trembling, I opened the first letter. The handwriting was familiar. My dearest Tiana, I sold the software company I built back in 1995. It was a turning point, but I chose to live quietly. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wanted you to grow up knowing that true worth isn't measured by money, but by character. I've funded scholarships, built schools, supported community organizations, all quietly. I wanted you to live a normal life, unburdened by wealth, and never forget kindness. You're grown now. You're strong enough. Use this money wisely, not to prove anything to the world, but to do good, to do what's right. I've always believed in you. I didn't know how long I sat there in that vault. Everything I thought I knew about my father and myself was erased and rewritten. The simple man who lived in a rented apartment, drove a beat-up car, cooked dinner in a rice cooker, turned out to be one of the first Black billionaires of the modern tech age. And he had hidden it all out of love for me. When I walked out of that bank clutching the folder, I no longer felt hollow from grief. I felt full of pride, because I wasn't just carrying his name anymore. I was carrying his legacy. It took me a few days to get everything in order. I worked with my father's lawyer, met financial advisors, and reviewed the estate he left behind. Even after taxes and the charitable commitments he had already made, I still inherited over $2 billion. I didn't tell anyone, especially not James. That evening, we sat across from each other in our small apartment. The soft light cast a worried look across his face. I told him everything about the safe, the tech company, my father, the man he once assumed was just a quiet government clerk. James was speechless. Then he kept repeating one question. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I looked him in the eye. Because I needed to know. If I had nothing, would you still stand by me? That question left him silent. And in that moment, I knew he was remembering everything. Every dinner where his mother made passive comments. Every time I was belittled. Every moment he stayed quiet when I needed him to speak up. A week later, we returned to his parents' house for dinner. I didn't make any announcements. I simply said I was taking a break from teaching to handle some family affairs, then casually mentioned I'd be meeting with a financial advisor to manage a small inheritance. Patricia, true to form, gave me a patronizing smile and gently patted my hand like I was a child who'd just earned her first $20 bill. "That's lovely. Having a little something set aside can be so helpful," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. I smiled. And then I took out the bank statement. I didn't say a word. The numbers spoke for themselves, the sound of shock, of shattered pride. Patricia turned pale. William dropped his wine glass, which shattered across the hardwood. James just sat there, mouth open, unable to speak. "There must be some mistake," Patricia stammered. "No mistake," I replied calmly. "My father was Robert Johnson, founder of Secure Flow Technologies. You may have heard of him." No one said a word for what felt like a full minute. But in that heavy silence, I heard something loud and clear, the collapse of every prejudice they had ever held about me. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to earn their approval. I was simply there as myself, and that was enough. After that dinner, no one dared speak to me with a patronizing tone again. Patricia tried to pivot. She sent emails inviting me to charity events, called to invite me to lunch, even texted to share how she'd always admired my late father. William suddenly acted like we were old colleagues asking about fintech trends. Even James's sister, who had once ignored me during an entire family dinner, now texted me to grab coffee. I saw it all, heard it all, and smiled politely. But deep down, I understood they didn't respect me. They respected the number in my bank account. And James? He didn't say much, but I could feel it. Something had cracked between us that love alone couldn't mend. He stopped joking like he used to, stopped walking me to school, stopped helping me hang student artwork on weekends. One day he asked, "You've changed, haven't you?" I stayed silent, because the truth was, he was the one who refused to change. A month passed in heavy silence, until one night James walked into the living room holding the prenuptial agreement. "I think maybe we should tear this up and start over. We can make it. We love each other. Right." I looked at him, not with anger, not with tears, just a quiet sorrow, the kind that comes when you've finally woken up. "James," I said, "the man I loved would never have asked me to sign that. He would have stood up for me before I even knew I needed protection. The man I loved would have seen my worth before he knew what I was worth." I placed the engagement ring on the table and kept the contract. Not because I wanted to hold on to bitterness, but because it was the greatest lesson of my life, written in cold ink, signed with tears I'll never forget. A year after I left James, my life had completely changed. Not because I was richer, but because I finally knew who I was. I used most of my father's estate to establish the Robert Johnson Foundation, a nonprofit that funds scholarships, builds libraries, and supports education for underserved communities. I didn't do it to prove anything. I did it because I knew my father would be proud, and because I wanted to be the woman he believed in. I still teach, but now I teach at the very school I built, where kids like me no longer have to worry about lunch money, textbooks, or condescending stares. I no longer seek acceptance. I walk my own path. And then, love returned gently. Not at a glamorous gala, not someone stepping out of a luxury car, but in a supermarket aisle while I was struggling to choose between two types of yogurt. Do you always smile like that, even when picking yogurt? I turned around and saw him, plain shirt, tired eyes, kind smile. His name was Elijah. He worked in social services helping at-risk youth. He didn't know who I was, didn't know how many zeros were in my account, But he knew I liked coffee without sugar, hated alarm clocks, and always touched my wrist when I was anxious. He knew I wasn't perfect and loved me for it. We didn't love each other to elevate one another. We loved each other because we truly saw each other. One time I told Elijah about James, about the prenup, about the nights I cried quietly. He didn't say much, just held my hand and said, "I'll never let anyone define you by their past." And I believed him, not because he promised, but because he lived it. Someone once said, "Money can't buy love." And I believe that, but I've also learned another truth: when you know your worth, you don't need love to beg for acceptance. My father once hid his fortune to teach me humility, and he was right. But the world taught me this: if you don't stand up for yourself, someone else will happily define your place. I've been underestimated because of my job, my skin, my background. I once signed a contract that practically spelled out, "You are not enough." And strangely, that very contract became the most valuable lesson I've ever received. It didn't just show me what others thought of me, it showed me what I thought of myself. I forgave James, not because he deserved it, but because I deserved to be free from that pain. I thanked Patricia, not for her kindness, but because she taught me to hold tight to my self-worth, even when no one sees it. And I honored my father not just for his wealth, but for the quiet belief he planted in me all my life. If you're hearing this story and have ever felt like you're not enough, not rich enough, not pretty enough, not the right kind, remember this. You don't need to become someone else to be loved. You just need the courage to be yourself. The rest will find its way. If this story touched you, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. Have you ever been judged for your background? I read every single one. See you in the next story, where worth isn't measured by reputation, but by the heart you carry.